Good evening and welcome to BNC Prime News. I'm TASHANEA filling in for Brittany Jones. Today marks 56 years since human rights activist Malcolm X was assassinated at a Manhattan ballroom. And new evidence tonight has been uncovered in the case. A letter written by former undercover officer Ray Wood on his deathbed indicates both the NYPD and the FBI conspired to infiltrate multiple civil rights organizations during the civil rights movement. Wood says he was tasked with ensuring that Malcolm X's security detail was arrested days prior to his assassination. The letter was addressed to Malcolm's 3 daughters. The family held a press conference on Saturday. Let's take a listen.
He lived in constant fear for over 46 years, worried about what the NYPD and the FBI would do to him and his family if he had told the dark secrets that he had held that helped destroy Black leaders and Black power organizations. Unsure how to release this information and keep my family safe, I reached out to attorney Ben Crump, who advised me to place everything that I knew, along with this letter, into a factual memoir.
There has always been uncertainty about all of the facts surrounding the assassination of my and my 5 sisters' father. Any evidence that provides greater insight into the truth behind that terrible tragedy should be thoroughly investigated. My mother turned this place, which once represented tragedy, into the Shabazz Center. It is a place of inspiration and learning, and discovering the truth is always most important to us.
And joining us now to dive deeper is our Chief Legal Correspondent, Dr. Laura McNeal. Dr. McNeal, thank you so much for joining us. It's always a pleasure having you. Now,
absolutely, Tashawnee.
Now let's dive right in. Now, can you tell us more about the evidence that has come forth alleging that the FBI and NYPD was involved in the death of Malcolm X?
Yes, and so as we all know, Malcolm X was shot and killed at the Audubon Ballroom, February 21st, 1965. What we did not know, but many in the Black community expected, or rather suspected, is that there might be some FBI involvement in his assassination. And what this very information that was released on Friday reveals is you have a former NYPD police officer saying, I was involved, I was coerced by both the FBI as well as his superiors within the New York Police Department to not only ensure that Malcolm X's security detail was not there to protect him on that day in which he was assassinated, but also his job was to infiltrate civil rights organizations throughout New York City for the purposes of finding evidence of some type of criminal activity to have them arrested and essentially taken out of that civil rights advocacy position. And the reason this information, or rather evidence, is so disturbing, Tashawnee, is the fact that, you know, we have for years had suspicions within the Black community about the possible role of law enforcement in not only the death of Malcolm X, but Martin Luther King Jr. as well. So to actually have a member of the police department come forth in this deathbed confession and say, I need to tell what really happened, it really makes us all pause, to be quite honest.
And Dr. Laura, can any of the individuals involved pursue legal actions against the NYPD or the FBI based on this evidence? And is the evidence even credible?
You know, again, that's going to take an investigation, whether or not they can confirm what is alleged in this letter as indeed being true, using this as a timeline to retrace the steps of that police officer to verify if the contents are indeed truthful. Now, we know that the lawyers representing Malcolm X's estate are calling for the case to be reopened, the criminal case. That is not out of the ordinary. So it's very possible that the the Manhattan District Attorney's Office will pursue an investigation into this letter to see the credibility of the evidence. And it's also possible that there might be a civil suit filed as well against the NYPD seeking redress for for what happened if, again, they can prove that the contents of this letter are accurate.
And considering that Malcolm X was killed over, actually today marks 56 years, if I'm not mistaken, what would an acceptable legal remedy be if these allegations are true?
You know, that's the tough part about the legal system. You can't really put a price on a loss of life. Malcolm X, as we know, was a father, he was a husband, a revered leader in the Black community. And so, how do you place a value on that? The best legal redress would be to hold any officers or members of the FBI that are still living accountable if indeed they are guilty of conspiring to kill Malcolm X. And I mean accountable through our criminal justice system. Also, I think that civil redress, meaning monetary compensation for the loss of life, would be very appropriate in this situation for Malcolm X's daughters.
And do you think this new evidence will impact law enforcement practices around the country, or will it just be business as usual?
You know, I really think it's going to have a powerful impact. And what I mean by that is we saw from the sea of protest this summer calling for increased accountability for misconduct amongst our law enforcement. And that's what we're asking for in this investigation. This is yet another piece of evidence potentially to demonstrate that not all of our law enforcement are upholding the law. And in actuality, some of them are breaking the law. And those individuals need to be held accountable. And this evidence is a push in that direction.
Dr. Laura, what was shocking to you, or were you shocked when this letter came out?
You know, I was absolutely shocked. And the reason why is that the fact that he was held onto this information for so many years, and I just couldn't imagine the fear he had for his safety of himself, the safety of his family. But I think what bothers me is we saw with the Capitol riots, TASHANEA, law enforcement's members were participating in the insurrection. And so, you know, it makes me wonder how many other pieces of evidence are out there that people are quite frankly afraid to come forward with that demonstrate that law enforcement is not always truthful, is not always holding the principles of justice in their actions. And why are we not holding them accountable? And so that was the biggest surprise to me, because I'm seeing the connection. I'm seeing a pattern in practice that is very disturbing, especially because it has the most harmful impact on communities of color.
And welcome back to BNC Prime Weekend. With just a few days left in Black history, startling new evidence in the 1965 assassination of human rights activist Malcolm X has been uncovered. Former undercover NYPD officer Raymond Wood confessed that during his time on the force, he voluntarily helped infiltrate civil rights organizations with the FBI, which ultimately led to the death of Malcolm X in a Manhattan ballroom. Now, before our break, we spoke with our chief legal correspondent, Dr. Laura McNeal, on what this new evidence could mean legally. But this new evidence also hits close to home for members of Malcolm X's family. Here to join us and to discuss more on this new evidence is his nephew, RODNELL Collins. Thank you so much for joining us, Mr. Collins.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate that.
So I must ask you, were you and your family shocked by the letter indicating the possible involvement of the FBI and police in your uncle's murder?
No, my uncle and my mother, we knew that. Long before that, we had a meeting in Central Park with a boss agent, who is a part of the the New York Police Department that the FBI has put in at that time, the New York Police Department, a division or area called BOSS, Bureau of Special Services. And we had been informed by someone from that division that the organization was infiltrated, Malcolm X Organization of Afro-American Unity. So my uncle knew that long before we knew who the agents were. In fact, his sister, my mother, Ella Collins, she mentions that in a press interview sometime at that time back in the mid-'60s, when the media interviewed her about the assassination of her brother. And she didn't name the agents or agents, but she spoke of this matter because initially we had called in way earlier before because of the problems that Uncle Malcolm was having with the Nation of Islam, that was not only working for the Nation of Islam, but it was working with outside forces.
And what do you remember, Mr. Collins? You said that that Uncle Malcolm was experiencing some issues with the nation, and that your aunt, or I believe it was
no, that's my mother. We're talking
your
about
mother.
his sister, Ella Collins. Yes.
So
it's a history of issues that the Nation of Islam was having, of corruption. There was a person that was John Ali had infiltrated. He was recruited by the intelligence services in the late 50s to the Nation of Islam. And there were other agents. You must remember and look at the history of African American struggle and the civil rights movement. There were over 7,000 informants and agents operating in America at that time, late 50s and 60s. World War II did not have that many agents operating in America for a cause, but investigating any activity by African Americans, that being the Nation of Islam, that being the civil rights movement. And so Uncle Malcolm understood that, and he had to operate in that type of environment.
mm-hmm.
So he had his people who were loyal to him and himself, but outside of that, he had his sister Ella. So we had our own private way of investigating individual people. And long before Uncle Malcolm was expelled from the Nation of Islam, we were exposing the corruption in the nation. And it all started here in Boston. And it eventually came out in a magazine early on called the Saturday Evening Post. And on the cover was a person by the name of Aubrey Barnett. He was an accountant. So a lot of things were exposed behind the scenes that my uncle was investigating with the help of his sister Ella, because she had the funds and the wherewithal to operate outside of what my uncle needed using. He didn't have any funds. He only had a stipend as a minister, and he could not use, and he would not use, the Nation of Islam's funds. So there was things going on behind the scene as far as investigations to expose the corruption and the infiltration of outside forces being those that were involved with the Ku Klux Klan, the Black Legions, who wanted to create disturbance and a race riot in America using the Nation of Islam. And Malcolm himself, my uncle himself, spoke about that. This is nothing new. He even spoke about and told the civil rights leaders at the time, James Farmer, Dr. Martin Luther King, A. Philip Randolph, that there's a hit job put out on you.
And did he specifically know that it was from the government? Did he indicate that? We're probably about a minute and a half left, Mr. Collins, so I'm sorry I have to move the interview along.
The outside forces were not just intelligence agencies. There were white supremacists and white racists that wanted to start a race war in America using the Nation of Islam and what they were saying and doing. So they planted people in the nation to deliberately divide and conquer. It's something that was used in slavery. It was something that was used in Africa and Asia to divide Black people against the others that had some sort of family problem. Elijah Muhammad was related to Malcolm's family, and the family had to try to operate in a way that this is a family thing. Elijah Muhammad's family is related to us, and that is known. So you have to bring in outside forces to infiltrate the nation and to disturb, make all kinds of disturbances and what have you. And in his latter days, Mr. Muhammad was not in the control of the Nation of Islam. It was John Ali and other people that had been infiltrated.
So, Mr. Collins, what is this letter? Does this letter change anything, or does it just highlight
Well,
what
the
you
letter
already
makes
knew.
the letter. These are things we already knew. As I said, ma'am, we had already we met with agent in Central Park in New York. Malcolm had also been informed by other people within the intelligence community that wanted to do the right thing. Wanted to do the right thing. You cannot blame the intelligence community in America, that being those in government, for America's all its race problems. You have people in corporations, in the Ku Klux Klan, and private organizations like that wanted to start the Black Legion. There are so many white organizations that are white supremacists, white Nazis. This whole business was deliberately to cause a division between blacks and whites in America.
Mr. Collins, I'm sorry, I have to cut you off. I have just one last question, if you can just briefly answer it for me. So what's next for your family?
Well, that's a decision up to my cousins. I am personally not the letter that you speak of. We already know what was happening. If there's something that Malcolm's estate or his daughters wish to proceed, the family supports that. We support them.
Okay.
We support the family. This is nothing new. In fact, there will be more information coming forth.
Well, we look forward to that. And Mr. Collins, we hope when that information does come forward that you would join us again on BNC. Hopefully we'll have more time, because this is definitely something that deserves more time and more light shined on it, especially after all this time. We thank you again for joining us on this day, which I'm sure is hard for your family. But thank you for joining us this evening, sir.
Thank you very much for having me.